Uh, Good afternoon. Welcome to Destination Newry once again. And today we are joined by local man Anthony Russell. And Anthony would be well known as a local historian and an academic of note. He is also an accredited authority on the life of John Mitchell, something which we will speak about later on. So you're very welcome, Anthony.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much for inviting me.
And just if we could briefly talk about yourself. I didn't know until quite recently. You told me that you were actually born in Rooney's Meadow.
I was indeed. I was born on 32 Gullion Road, way back in the 1950s, James.
Very good. And then I remember you. Over in Dominic Street.
That's right. I spent most of my formative years in Dominic Street, in 54 Dominic Street, which of course was a tremendous joy because you had the glen opposite you, and the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 glens there. And myself and the Heaney brothers and the Rooney brothers spent our childhood up and around the river in the glen. So it was a tremendous place.
And being in close proximity to St Catherine's, yourself and our local MLA, Mickey Brady, were involved in an organisation.
It was the Angelic Warfare Society, or Sodality. So both of us have a sort of a military past.
Well, for the benefit of those who wouldn't know, could you explain what this sodality was about, Anthony?
It was a fancy name for the Dominican altar boys.
Yeah, I was quite worried that night in Buttercrane when you talked about it, and I was wondering if the ceasefire covered the aforementioned sodality. Oh, by the way, we do have immunity from prosecution on this programme.
We decommissioned our thoroughfares a long time ago.
Very good. And of course then, Anthony, over in Dominic Street at that time, I remember in the houses there, and we'll talk about it later, but Jenny Werner actually lived in one of those houses, didn't she?
She did, and that's what sparked my interest in John Mitchell, because I remember my father telling me the story of John Mitchell and Jenny Werner. Mm-hmm. And the house we lived in was built by the brewer Arthur Russell, Lord Russell, Killowen's father. And we were in number 54. And Jenny eloped from number 52. Mm-hmm. And then the end of the row was Lord Russell of Killowen's house. So it was a famous row to be associated with.
And just when you mentioned the gentleman, Lord Russell was...
Lord Russell was the first Catholic Lord Chief Justice of Britain, England, after the Reformation.
And his bust is in the town hall, isn't that right?
There's a large bust in the town hall. I think there's now a plaque in Dominic Street, or Queen Street as it was, to him.
Yeah, that's right. The name was changed. The then Urban Council changed the name in 1950 from Queen Street to Dominic Street in relation to the church. But just Anthony, to recap about that time in Dominic Street, I mean, you were in very close proximity, obviously, to, as was said, St Catherine's, but from the social point of view in the street, you had John McAteer's shop, Vincey Burke right beside you, and of course Con McBarn, which was formerly P.D. Loughran's.
That's right, yeah. And amazing that there were 3 shops. In fact, there was a 4th shop because trainers then opened a shop.
Yeah.
In the old mill terrace there beside Lupton's Mill. So at one stage there were 4 shops along Dominic Street.
And then, as you mentioned in Buttercrane, we had the colourful character of Harry Galloway.
We did indeed. Harry's Ice Cream Factory was on Dominic Street, and Harry was a wonderful man. When you were kids knocking around the street, he would open the door and hand you out a bag of broken wafers from his ice cream shop. And one of my earliest memories is lying in the bed in 32 Gullion Road and hearing Harry's horn as he came on the tricycle, and my father bringing up ice cream to us then on a summer's night.
And I remember then when Harry progressed to the van, and the slogan was Harry's aces are the nicest.
With all due respect to Timonies at the time, they probably were.
And of course, then just down round the corner on Bridge Street, not to forget, we had Danny O'Hanlon's shop.
We did, and Big Donald, of course, is still in the town. Donald he's still chair of the New Point Players. Mm-hmm. It too was a tremendous spot. You would call in there on your way to the Abbey to get, I think, a huge big 3D bun that would last you most of the day that you could buy in the O'Hanlon shop. And of course, there's that tremendous photograph which we had in the butter crane of the street flooded, Pool Lane and Bridge Street flooded from the Distillery River. That was way back in the early 60s, I think.
That's right.
I remember that flood because our garden went down to Thomas Street, and they had to break a hole in our garden wall to let the water out to bring the levels down on Thomas Street.
Now, just Anthony, just to develop on that, you spoke about the flood playing that night in Buttercrane, and could you explain to people watching this? Could you explain where the problem of the flooding over the years in the Bridge Street, Pool Lane, Thomas Street area, where it originates from?
It's the old story that a floodplain, it does exactly what it says on the tin, it floods. And that area between High Street and Dominic Street was created by the river. It's all alluvium. And when they're building houses in Hill Street, for example, they find it very difficult to get foundations. A lot of the old houses are just sitting on top of the mud. Therefore, it is a floodplain, and a floodplain is going to flood. The river is going to reclaim its birthright. Mm-hmm. So Hill Street, Mary Street, Bridge Street, they're all liable to flooding. Now, of course, with modern engineering, hard engineering, for the last 20 years, it hasn't happened.
And hopefully won't.
Well,
now, Anthony, you mentioned going to school, and school, of course, for us was the old alma mater, the grammar, starting with the primary school and then the Abbey Grammar. Well, what do you recall about that walk from Dominic Street up to Courtney Hill?
In my later years, my O-level and A-level years, it was a very joyous walk. It was a very, very happy time at the Abbey. But there were times, perhaps, in the junior years when it just wasn't such a joyous walk. Maybe you hadn't the homework done properly, and you knew what was waiting for you when you got to the Abbey. But when you think back upon it, it was quite normal for us to leave the Abbey and go home for our dinner, and then head back and buy something at O'Hanlon's shop, and then head back in for lessons in the afternoon. I'm glad you mentioned the Abbey Primary, because on Friday it's celebrating its 75th anniversary. That lovely red brick building there on Courtney Hill.
Yeah. We were there recently for a talk with the Maritime Association, and actually a man who taught both of us at school, the late Mickey Sweeney, his son Eddie is the principal.
He is. So there's nice continuity there, nice tradition.
And then we had Colin Bell as well.
The college there, indeed. The college, of course, is very much part of the fabric of the town, as the whole family is.
His father Johnny been there in our era as well.
He was VP in our era.
So one of the things that has gone now, Anthony, from that walk, it was a totally different walk then. We had, of course, the active port.
We did, and you and I probably, maybe you don't, James. I remember rushing up to tell Mr. Haffey that the canal had emptied. I think it was way back in 1968. 1968. It was quite a shock to be taking that walk and see that there was no water in the canal.
And that's something I remember well, the canal drying out after the St. William had collided with the outward sea gates of Victoria Locks back in January 1968. It's hard to believe, Anthony, that that's coming 45 years ago.
That's incredible, James.
45 years.
Yeah, it is.
But when you think of the activity that there was around the port area then, and the sadly today dereliction.
Well, it was the end of the port, James. You know yourself that most of the trade was fishers' trade. It was mostly colliers. The odd timber ship came in, and that was sort of a diversion. But it was the olive and the walnut, and of course the Dundalk sitting on the other shore. But it was a fairly limited trade by that stage, despite the fact that at the tail end then there was an attempt to put containerisation down where the mill is.
Yeah, that's right. The link line were there from about 1967 or 8.
Yeah.
But as you say, it was Newry had passed its sell-by date literally, and it was confined by the restrictions at depth of water, at narrow water, and obviously then the logistics of Victoria Locks and the canal, which were limited the size of the ships which could come to the port.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons. Not the only reason for the reason why in the 19th century, for example, Belfast took off and Newry didn't. Newry didn't follow Belfast in the industrial expansion of the 19th century, because Newry, very proud of our canal as we are. The canal is of limited size, and in many ways that holds you to that size. Whereas the merchants in Belfast just kept digging and digging and digging, and they have excavated a tremendous harbour at the head of Belfast Lough. There are descriptions in the 1700s of Newry and Belfast, and they sound very, very familiar, describing the mudflats in Belfast when the port was in High Street, and the ships having to lie off, and there was at the Pool of Garmoyle, and down here in Newry, then obviously our mudflats, and the ships having to lie off in the Doily Hole. So it's they were similar, and part of the reason, but not the only reason, is that we were probably too proud of our canal.
But at the same time, Anthony, Newry actually was the leading port. It was actually ahead of Belfast in the embryonic stages.
Yes. Yes. At the time of the canal, when the canal first went in the 1730s, then the canal was extremely significant. It was tremendous technology in those days. It was marvellous technology. It would have been the equivalent of the space shuttle or whatever today. But from a geographical point of view, the reason for that was the canal went up to Lough Neagh, and once you were into Lough Neagh, then the whole of Ulster became your hinterland. Now, if you had all those goods, all those potential goods and products and crops being funneled down through Newry, Newry's merchants waiting to add value and to process it. For Newry, it was because of the canal that Newry expanded at that time.
Yeah, but as you say, sadly, we then were eclipsed and got left behind.
We got left behind because of the Industrial Revolution, really, when the size of your hinterland was no longer the significant factor in the development of your town. It was your proximity to a coal and the size of your harbour that became much more important. Trade became outward facing, trade became international, and the hinterland in your backyard wasn't as significant in your development.
And so, as you quite rightly say, Belfast progressed rapidly.
Well, Belfast really is a British coalfield port. Belfast joined the British Industrial Revolution. And of course, there are many things going on underneath, politically underneath that, because the Presbyterian merchants who developed Belfast then obviously saw that their prosperity and their future lay with the British coalfields, and they orientated away from Dublin, which at that stage was then a neutered capital because of the loss of its parliament and the Act of Union, with the Act of Union. So again, these things are never the full story, but there is a large economic reason for the reorientation of the Ulster Presbyterian community away from the idea of Irish republicanism, which many of them had embraced in the late 1700s, to British unionism in the 19th century.
Well, now, Anthony, how would you describe the importance, or how would you rate the importance of the port to the development of Newry, and how it has evolved into the city that we have today?
There's a paradox in that, as I've already suggested, the fact that we were so canal based limited our development. On the other hand, any development we had was due to the canal and improvements in the canal. The last big improvement was probably 1850, when the ship canal from what is now the Albert Basin down to Victoria Locks opened, because at the time that was a very significant waterway, even in terms of ships at that time, and it allowed Newry to briefly join the Industrial Revolution. And from that period then we had our three major mills, and four if you include Bestbrook. We had the mill at Drummondane, the mill in Corn Market, and the mill just behind us here in Edward Street. And
Wilson's.
And in a form of cumulative causation, then Newry developed very rapidly, because once you had the mill workers, then you had wages, you had a demand for housing, you had a need for shops, you had a need for machinery, and the foundries then got in on the act. So it was a period of economic expansion, but it was short-lived, mainly because the American Civil War had ended, cotton came back in the world market, our linen mills then couldn't really compete, and there was a long period of stagnation.
And so that would have led to the demise of, for instance, Drummondane Mill.
It did. It's I think it was the last one, wasn't it? It stuttered through. Did it get to the 1970s?
1965, I think.
It was the last one to stutter on, but the writing was on the wall for them, because the linen was not competitive.
Right. Now, you mentioned also there, to get back just to school and the Abbey Grammar School, and you mentioned, of course, a man pretty much synonymous with the Abbey Grammar School and with generations of lads who went there, Jimmy Hoffey.
I have an awful lot of time for Jimmy Hoffey, but Jimmy knows that. And one of the great things is that when we're giving lectures around the town and that in the area, James Hoffey's always there. And of course you're always aware of that. It's the old schoolmaster watching you, so you have to watch your P's and Q's with him in the audience. But he was a kindly teacher, and he was a very good teacher.
Well, he also, it's reciprocal, he speaks very highly of yourself, and is a particular fan of your presentations and lectures.
Well, I remember he was one of the first to introduce audiovisual aids and so on, and that up in the Abbey Grammar, which is of course now it's no used as a school, but in Jimmy's A-level geography room, he would have his projector and his slides, and we'd explain how ports developed and so on. He made geography very interesting.
I also remember one of the things that I remember from his geography classes was when he left the class, there was always a lot of drawings and information and the use of coloured chalk on the board.
The use of coloured chalk, that's right. He drew fantastic diagrams, but they weren't diagrams for diagrams' sake. They always had a clear message in them. And I'd like to think that as a teacher, a lot of the skills that I used in my own teaching, they had their origins in Jimmy Hoffey's geography classes.
Well, that's a great tribute to give Jimmy, and no doubt when he sees this, it'll stand you in good stead. I think now and again you're just you're what will we say? You're to be watched. You're to be watched. But anyway, Anthony, you went on and you became a teacher yourself, and shock horror. You didn't come back to the Abbey Grammar School.
Well, James, you had to go where the family was going to be fed, so I ended up in St. Coleman's College for a while.
When you say a while, that was about a quarter of a century.
It was about a quarter of a century, James, it was. And I enjoyed teaching. It was, you can build all sorts of fantasy worlds when you're teaching. You can tell stories when you're teaching, so it's an enjoyable profession.
And then after the college, what came after the college?
After the college, I joined Tesco, who have now arrived in town, as an academic advisor in their Tesco SchoolNet 2000 project. And then from that, I spent the rest of my career really at third level.
And of course, I mentioned the fact in the introduction about your interest in being a historian, your interest in local history, and you've got very much involved in the local history, and of course you're the chairman of the Old Newry Society, and also of the Young Irelanders group, and you're a very active member of the Newry Maritime Association, and we're very privileged to have you for your knowledge and advice and guidance there. But one of the main features that you're involved in, as I said, is the story of John Mitchell. Now, a lot of people watching this would know that John Mitchell was very much connected with Newry, and they wouldn't really know a lot more. But John Mitchell was actually born in Dungiven.
He was. He was, and he moved to Newry when about, I think he was born in 1815, so he moved to Newry about 1823, I think, with his father. When his father became the Presbyterian minister here, and they lived in Drumlane. The house is still, of course. And I think the most significant thing about Mitchell is his association, or his love for Jenny Werner. And I think when you look at that story of the two of them over several continents and over several decades, then I think it is probably the most spectacular love story that there is.
Now, it's a story, obviously, of two lifetimes, but briefly, Anthony, we mentioned about Jenny Werner and the fact that she grew up in Dominic Street. Could you just give us a brief overview of that story of Jenny Werner and John Mitchell, and how they came to lose two sons fighting for the Confederacy in the American Civil War? It's a spectacular story from Dominic Street on the Drumlane Road across the world, and ending sadly with all the family interred in various locations.
It is, and obviously time is limited, James. It's as you know, we took it to a consortium of schools in Craigavon, Jerry Doherty, myself, and Donal O'Hanlon, and others, and we presented it as a story, as an illustrated story with music. And I think for 2.5 hours, we had around 200 school kids from both traditions, 5th years, 6th years, in a cold assembly hall one Friday morning. And the sheer power of the story meant that they sat there, they listened to us, and there was hardly a sound out of them. So I think that is testimony to the power of the love story of John Mitchell and Jenny Werner.
And of course, we were also at Drumcree Parish Church as guests of the Reverend Gary Galway and the Select Vestry. Drumcree being such a focal point of unrest and division in the late 1990s, and the presentation was given there as well.
It was one of the things behind the Young Ireland project that we're involved in with Alton Bay House is that we try to use history to unite rather than divide, and we try to look at the myths of history and realise that most of our decisions in terms of our own lives with regard to history are made on myth, and the fact is much more interesting. And of course I use the term fact advisedly because facts have an awful lot to do with perception. But that said, our basic idea is that we cast a cold eye on history's hotspots. Together, we cast a cold eye on history's hotspots. And the story of John Mitchell and Jenny Werner is terrific because Mitchell was the son of a Presbyterian minister. Jenny was from one of the big houses. The Werners were associated with the founding of the Orange Order. And then they were part of the Young Ireland movement. Young Ireland movement is very much from this area. You have Gavin Duffy, for example, in Monaghan. You have Darcy McGee in Carlingford. You have Mitchell here. You have John Martin just out the road. Very, very different men, all and women. Because I think of Oscar Wilde's mother, Esperanza, the poetess, who was a great follower of John Mitchell. But they were very different, And because they were very different, then from a modernist perspective, they allow us to appreciate that diversity and our own diversity. For example, Thomas D'Arcy McGee was a Catholic, but he ended up as a founding father of Canada and was a Canadian loyalist. But even that term is problematic because a Canadian loyalist is not the same as an Ulster loyalist. Although McGee obviously is an attractive figure for anyone from the Unionist community because his transformation was very different from Mitchell's throughout his life. So we just don't look at Mitchell, we look at that whole Young Ireland period. But undoubtedly, the star of our show is the love story between John Mitchell and Jenny Byrne.
And that actually crossed the world.
It did. South Africa, Brazil, Nicaragua, California, New York, Gettysburg, Fort Sumter. Just goes on, James. It's a spectacular story. And not forgetting Van Diemen's Land and imprisonment down there and escape on horseback on the magistrate's horse and so on.
Well, then, of course, Anthony, with the Civil War in America, Mitchell was on the Confederate side.
He was, and therein lies the dark side of Mitchell.
Yes.
Essentially, he was a Roman, and it's no coincidence that in the speech from the dock he described himself as such. Now, if he was a Roman, the British were Carthaginians, and the British are termed Carthaginians in the wonderful jail journal. But if you're a Roman, and Mitchell really thought that human thought, intellectual development hadn't gone much beyond the Romans. Everything else was technological. He dismissed the 19th century just as utilitarian, based on technology. And unfortunately, therefore, he loved the idea of hierarchy. And embedded in his love of hierarchy was his acceptance and his support, his very active support, unfortunately, of slavery. When plantation owners realised that that slavery was something that was probably through the generations going to wither on the vine, Mitchell was actively asking for the African slave trade to be reopened. Now that puts him way beyond most Confederates. And as I said, it's a dark side to his character, but one that I think has to be understood in his own philosophical and intellectual position.
And really and truly, Anthony, how would you think that again we have to look at the context of the times that the man lived in and how society was then, of which he was part, and you have to judge in the day type of thing. But how would you think he would have been disposed towards the slaves, for want of a better word, who worked for him?
He never owned slaves. That's the strange thing. He never had any economic or physical interest in slaves. It was a theoretical position that he had. That he thought that essentially they were not the equivalent of Irish people, for example. But it's not an unusual position, as you suggested, in the 19th century, and even Arthur Griffiths, in his preface to Jail Journal, it was in 1904, whenever it was, made the point that why should we criticise Mitchell, because everybody knows that a black man could never be the equivalent of an Irishman. It was common currency at that time. On the other hand, you have people like Lincoln, who had a much broader and deeper vision and a much better view of what the future might be. And looking at the Cecil D. Lewis film of Lincoln, when you look at it, and oddly enough, looking at it just yards from Mitchell's house, you realise very, very firmly that Mitchell was on the wrong side of history, both in terms of the Confederacy and in terms of slavery.
And as you say, it's ironic that film was shown within hailing distance of John Mitchell's house in the Omniplex.
It is. But again, even that, that's an economic transformation of a piece of space. And if people transformed as readily as space transforms, then the world might be a better place.
But I'm really intrigued because I wasn't aware until you mentioned it there now. I wasn't aware that Mitchell never had slaves himself. And how would you square that circle with his thinking? You know, you would imagine that a man like him, it would have followed that subscribing to slavery, he would have been an active participant.
There's two parts, I suppose, to the answer. One is it was a philosophical position, it was a theoretical position that he had. It was a part of his hierarchical view of what society should be. His view that the 19th century was utilitarian and it wasn't real progress in the 19th century. In fact, he said he hated progress and he hated the 19th century. The other side of the answer is he was a journalist. And journalists generally didn't have slaves. He was a newspaper man, a newspaper owner, so he wouldn't have really have needed slaves. Now, Jenny, for example, when she was running her houses, could have had black slaves, and she never did.
So, how important is the role of John Mitchell in Irish republicanism?
Extremely important. For Pearse, he was one of the evangelists for 1916, and probably more significantly, when you look at De Valera's economic policies between 1932, whenever it was when he came to power, and Lemass, then that is Mitchell. The speech that De Valera gave about Ireland with the maidens and so on and so forth. There's a passage in Jail Journal which is very, very similar to that. The idea that Ireland is separate and will be separate. That's all part of Mitchell. On the other hand, then, when Lemass came and started looking outwards and embraced a different economic theory, essentially, then Mitchell has fallen backwards. And his view of the famine also, of course, went out of favour as well. So I would say Mitchell was a very important figure in Irish life and Irish republicanism up until Lemass. And then after Lemass, his ideas have subsided. Now, the importance of his ideas.
Well, Anthony, just again regarding the famine, could you tell us, just fill us in on Mitchell's ideas and theories on the famine?
Mitchell blamed the British. Mitchell blamed the British for everything.
Yeah.
It's historians probably when they've had a pint would say that he hated Britain more than he loved Ireland, and there's a large element of truth in that. For example, when he was at parties in the Confederacy, and he was discussing literature with the Bells, one of them, I forget who it was, some general's wife pointed out that Mitchell loved all literature, but he was particularly critical of British literature. And her point was that even in his reading, he was anti-British.
And would you say you mentioned De Valera and how he seemed to follow Mitchell's thinking? Would you say that Mitchell was, for want of a better word, insular in his thinking?
He was, yes. He was. He had a very inert view of society. He accepted the landlords were there. He accepted that the peasants were there, and his idea of political reform was that the landlords would treat their peasants in a better way. Whereas Thomas Paine, of course, from The Rights of Man, had a totally different philosophy. He wanted to change society totally. That's what, in many ways, what the Enlightenment was about. Mitchell had no time for the Enlightenment. So when you say was he insular in the sense that he liked the idea of an inert society. And the Ireland that De Valera tried to promote in the first years of his premiership in many ways he was harking back to that idea of an inert society where values would remain constant and people would remain constant, and change was to be you were to be suspicious of change.
And really and truly, to look at it, again, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but it was governance under the evil era. It really was governance. The people were being ruled.
Well, this is the job of any government to rule. But obviously, as we saw in Thatcherism, for example, governments do have influence, and governments can decide and will decide the prevailing philosophy, political philosophy at any particular time. So we shouldn't be surprised that De Valera had a major influence in Ireland.
Yeah, but I'm saying from the point of view, and it's interesting that you mentioned Margaret Thatcher there, because we see the legacy of division that even her death caused, and I'm just thinking, like, from the time that De Valera was in power, we had that alliance of church and state, and censorship and things like that, and of course the Archbishop of Dublin at the time, he was maybe as powerful as the people charged with ruling the country, John Charles McQuaid. He was a very powerful figure when it came to the civil end of things. Never mind ecclesiastical matters.
Well, we can see that being played out at the moment. But to look at it from a more historical perspective, Mitchell actually liked Catholicism. Now, he was a Presbyterian. He barely believed in God, if at all. His daughter Henrietta, when they were in Paris, joined a convent, and little Rixie, his youngest daughter, she went to a convent school in Paris. And Mitchell didn't object. And one reason he didn't object was because he liked the idea of Catholicism. And in fact, I think he said he did say there was a hankering towards whatever it was of Catholicism within his family. He liked the fact that the Catholic Church resisted change, from what I've already said, would show that that idea would have appealed to Mitchell. The fact that the Catholic Church likes hierarchy, that would have appealed to Mitchell. So I suppose it's another factor in De Valera's acceptance of Mitchell's ideas.
So really, if I know it's a hypothetical situation, but had Mitchell been alive after independence, would it be fair to say that had he been in power, he would have presided over a conservative regime?
Well, I have to bring you back now to Mr. James Haffey. And Mr. James Haffey would point out that an historical geographer would not get into such fantasizing.
But I'm asking Anthony Russel, historian and accredited authority on John Mitchell, how would you see, would he have been conservative in his thinking? Would there have been much change in the country? I was intrigued about, how you spoke about, for instance, the landlords. He wouldn't have seen the abolition of that system, but he would have liked to saw the tenants treated better. But would we have seen much development with a man like that?
I think Mitchell was, if we want to sum him up in one sentence, and it's always dangerous to try and do so, but Mitchell wasn't a revolutionary. He was a rebel, but he wasn't a revolutionary. And by that I mean, he didn't see the Enlightenment as the tremendous event that other people saw the Enlightenment. He didn't trace his philosophical and political roots to the Enlightenment as many people in the 19th century did. He went on back to classical times. So in that sense, yes, he was a very conservative figure.
And how important is he to us here in Newry, Anthony? Where do you see the legacy of John Mitchell, and how can we embrace that?
Well, he's a wonderful embarrassment, I think is the best way to describe it. The story of John Mitchell and Jenny Werner is superb. You're sick listening to me, hearing me say it, James, but when you take Gone with the Wind, you take Titanic, you take Ryan's Daughter, you take The Quiet Man, all fantastic films in their own right, all great romantic films, but all made
fictional.
Up. Made up. The story of John Mitchell and Jenny Werner happened on our streets, spread out from our streets to the globe, and it's a real life story. So how important is he? I would hope that in the future he will be very important, because when people appreciate just how spectacular the story of John Mitchell and Jenny Werner is, then the same way as people go down to Cong to see where Maureen O'Hara and John Wayne walked and rode the bicycle and so on, people will come to Newry. And I think that's why it's very important that we focus on Jenny, because in many ways Jenny was the more admirable character. In the 19th century, she was a phenomenal and formidable woman. She got seasick, and yet she travelled from here to Van Diemen's Land, from Van Diemen's Land to America, etc. A seasickness. Anybody who's gone to Le Havre will know what seasickness is like. She crossed oceans. So I think it's time that we put up a statue to Jenny Werner. And in 2015 is the 200th anniversary of the birth of John Mitchell. So I think the town of Newry should give him a birthday present, just as we give John Martin a birthday present when we
Last year
when we opened the memorial garden for him.
Uh-huh.
I think John Mitchell's birthday present should be a statue of Jenny up beside him in John Mitchell Place.
Well, I would have to agree with you there, and hopefully it will come to pass, because again, sadly, we seem blighted with an apathy towards our past here in Newry.
I don't think we're any different from anywhere else, James. But there are people like yourselves, the Maritime Association and other societies, who see it as their mission to educate the rest of the community about their history. And that's a good thing.
How important is the contribution, in your opinion? How important is the contribution of the voluntary sector in that regard?
I think one word sums up: passion. People in local history who get involved in local history, or local drama for that matter, they're passionate about it. And that passion drives them forward. And some great things result from it. We mentioned Donal Hanlon and Sean Hollywood and New Point Players, Sean Trainer. Some magnificent productions, because these people have passion for what they're doing. And local history is the same. And there are monuments being developed around the town because people in the Maritime Association realise that history is important to us, it shouldn't be forgotten, and they're passionate about it. So the one thing that I think marks out good community and voluntary work is passion. People have a passion for their topic, and they will devote hours to it.
Well, you certainly wouldn't be doing it for financial gain, that's for sure.
Not at all, no. But then why should you? Because for most people it's a hobby, it's something that they love doing.
Exactly. But again, Anthony, you were heavily involved in Newry 850 in the campaign for city status, which was very successful.
No, I was not involved in the campaign for city status.
Oh, you weren't?
I was involved in Newry 850.
Oh, 850, yeah. And that was in
1994.
Right, and in actual fact, there was a great publication.
Proud People.
Proud People. And who actually published that?
It was the committee, the 850 committee. I wasn't on the 850 committee. I was just involved with Sean Patterson in putting the exhibition together. But it was the committee that did that, and the chair of it was another great Newry man, Jerry. Oh, it's a senior moment here.
Jerry.
For the Abbey Primary.
Oh,
Jerry McNulty.
McNulty.
Yeah, excuse me. Let me Jerry
Me.
McNulty. And Jerry was the chair of Newry 850. Jerry made sure that that book was produced as a legacy of that time. Uh, and he was also the one who put the Proud People Monument into Market Square. And I think that's a fantastic piece of work. It used to be over in the shadows closer to the cathedral. Now it's out in the middle of the square. And
Yeah, I think the relocation has done wonders for it, because really and truly it wasn't really seen.
Yeah, and when the sunlight hits it now, you can see it's a 3D thing, and when the sunlight hits it now, you can see the contrast that you're supposed to see when you look at it. But I come back, you talked about the community sector, the voluntary sector. Jerry McNulty is another man who has done tremendous work because he has a passion for the town, both in drama and local history, particularly the Proud People book and that monument.
Well, another, you mentioned already the contribution made by Sean Hollywood, and sadly Sean passed away at an early age, the relatively young age of 54, and he also was a former colleague of yours in St Coleman's.
He was. Sean was a terrific teacher. Everybody has a good word about Sean Hollywood. Everybody has a story about Sean Hollywood. I have a few, but they're probably more for a staff room or a pub than for this medium.
Well, I'm sure you have something you could tell us about him.
Well, there's one incident where. No, I won't bother James.
Well, there was wasn't there an episode with the union with a minister coming to St Coleman's, and he organised a protest with the teachers' union.
Oh yes, it was. I think it was the time of civil rights, and as you know, Sean was very, very actively involved. In the civil rights. That was just before I joined the staff up there, and I think Willie Whitelaw was coming to the college.
That's right.
So I think Sean organised a protest or something at that time.
And no doubt that wouldn't have sat well with the management of the college at the time.
Well, when you're involved in civil rights, by very nature, you're taking on the powers that be. So obviously not.
But as you say, a character, and again, that passion that you talked about, he manifested that in everything, that be it sport, with his hurling, athletics, obviously his passion for the arts, the encouragement for young people particularly. I mean, I think everybody recognises how passionate he was about getting young people involved in drama and the arts.
Well, I think it's fair to say that he chose to spend his life in his hometown, and if he'd chosen to go somewhere else, then he would have been a national or an international figure.
Now, his cousin, Jared Murphy, of course, Jared went on to the Royal Shakespeare Company.
He did, and Jared is one of those people who, again, comes back to the town and has a great love for the town, and is very generous in his tributes to people who helped him in the town. I think of Miss Ethel Fitzpatrick, for example, whom I think he did a TV programme highlighting how valuable she was to the development of his career.
That's right. The time he did the documentary, Miss Ethel, as she was known to us all at that time, he paid a great tribute to her, and she was actively involved, and that particular lady is synonymous, with the encouragement of and development of arts and drama, the fish, all that sort of thing. Her name always came up when we were children, and she made a tremendous contribution, Anthony.
She did, and she's typical of what was going on in the town before the Troubles and throughout the Troubles. The arts particularly, and local history, kept people together and kept people going throughout the Troubles. The Old Newry Society, for example, kept going all through the Troubles. It has been and always will be, I hope, a cross-community society. Likewise, the drama festival. These things kept the heart in the town during the trouble, and it was individuals like Ethel behind the scenes working away that kept these things going, and provided tremendous role models for the next generation coming along.
And really, really, Anthony, they epitomise that phrase, unsung heroes.
And of course they do, yes, yeah. Yes.
But you mentioned there the Old Newry Society, and you're now the chairman of the society, which has been going, is it 40 years?
1968 it started, and it's been going ever since.
And every year it seems to go from strength to strength. I thought this year particularly the standard of speakers and the subject matter was a particularly good year.
Well, we have a policy within the society that we will go out to the town and we'll go to where the history is or where the history was made. Therefore, for example, we had our annual dinner in the Masonic Lodge. We had our lecture in Ballybot in the Buttercrane Centre, where the sawmills and where the port and the breweries were. So we went to Ballybot. Next year we will go to High Street, and we look at High Street. But going back to Miss Ethel, with Charlie Smith addressed the society and with Ethel addressed the society, and they were going to tell the story of Newry. Now, they were both wonderfully, humorously entertaining, but they didn't tell the story of Newry. They told the story of each of their part of Newry. Miss Ethel over in the East Bank, Charlie over in the West Bank. And towns are like that people grow up in neighbourhoods, and it's the neighbourhood first, then the town, if you like, then the country. So when you have engaging people like Charlie and Miss Ethel talking, they tend to talk about the streets that they were born in, the streets that they grew up in, and then look out to the wider town. So that's why last year we did Ballybot.
Yeah.
And then
which destination you're here recorded on it, and it's on the internet now.
It's out there. And then next year we're going to do High Street, and the Reverend Hutton has already agreed that we will be able to do it in St Patrick's Church, which would be a wonderful thing.
Well, it is. It's great to get out and about and you meet people. And last year, or in February past, when we were in Buttercrane, of course, we had the presentation to a lady who is now the oldest resident, Mrs. Brady.
Well, he's that James, Diane, my wife. So we're taking a walk in Omeath last night, walking through Omeath graveyard, and Professor Brady. We just accidentally came across James Brady's grave down there, and he's lying not too far from another great Newry man, Mr. Cranny, who ran the St Patrick's School out there. So Newry has produced some wonderful people, and very often, as you have suggested, they do their life's work. They make a tremendous contribution, and then we all fade away.
Well, Jim was a professor of law in Dublin, wasn't he?
I think so, James.
And you recently were telling me that in connection with Darcy McGee, you were speaking to another Newry professor, now retired, John Kelly.
Oh, John, yes, right, yeah. We launched the Darcy McGee Summer School in the Canadian Embassy a couple of months ago. Professor John Kelly was there, and being a Newry man, of course, he expressed great interest in what we're doing down here, so hopefully he'll come down and talk to us. And
of course, John Kelly, being a son of J.V. Kelly, who was the gents outfitter at the corner of Mill Street and Hill Street, right, and the shop still there. So the next project, Anthony, is hopefully for the statue of Jenny Werner for 2015. Yeah. And how is that progressing now? Well, we have a 2-year lead in, Jim. So the one that, as you know yourself, the major thing is to get financial backing. So that's what we're working on at the moment. But again, we started with a blank sheet, with a blank check.
not the popular image of a blank cheque. We actually had a blank cheque, nothing on it, for John Martin, but we managed to fill it. So hopefully, the same will be true of raising the money for Jenny's statue. I must say, again, you mentioned community, and one of the tremendous things about our John Martin Memorial is that it was paid for by the business folk of Newry. If you go down to the monument itself, you'll see a board there, and I think there are 19 or 20 local businesses and local people who very generously contribute to putting that there. And I'm reminded of, going back to Sean Hollywood again, when I was PRO for Newpoint Players as a young man, and I did I think it was the 40th anniversary brochure for them, and I started at one end of Hill Street, on Mock Hill Street, went and visited all the shops. I think it was Gibbons and so on, and every shop had either a fiver or a tenner for me. By the time I got to the end of Hill Street, and then of course up Monmouth Street here, it was paid for. If you try to do that now, then you hit franchises, and they have to go to head office, and so that is something that has changed in the town. But scrape a little deeper, and you find the 20 people that contributed to the John Martin Monument. And since we're here publicly, I'd like to publicly thank them, because that really was in a spirit of generosity, appreciating how important our history is to us.
Well, last year we were very fortunate with the memorial stone at Victoria Locks for the Privet and the Walnut, the crews who were lost. And again, we got tremendous support from traders in the town, and it was also really, really satisfying, the support which came from the Fathom, Killian, Clonshagora areas, from businesses there, such as Morgan Fuels and the Modern Day.
I see you're wearing their shirt there, James.
Yeah, being an Armagh supporter. Now out of date, they're no longer the team sponsors.
No longer the team they were, James.
But oh, you never miss a trick, Anthony, do you? But better days will come. Better days will come. But no, it was great to see. The Fathom area made such a contribution to the port, and 6 of the victims on that stone came from what was then the Fathom Road, the Flagstaff Road as we know it today. And within 10 months, 6 men had lost their lives on that road.
As you've shown in your research and your books, it was a very, very dangerous occupation.
Yeah.
Being a sailor out of Newry.
Yeah.
I know Sean Patterson has been saying that for
years.
Yeah. But going back to I think it would be remiss not to mention Newry Mourne District Council, because I found that when you come up with a project, there are people in the council who come along and support you wholeheartedly, and point you in the right direction. And I'm sure you've found the same thing, James, as you have.
Well, I was just about to mention that, Anthony, because we've just in the last couple of days positioned an anchor at Fisher Park, which has been refurbished by Newry and Mourne Council, and we have now put the anchor in. We've had great support. The council are making a submission, an application to DSD, which you're involved with, for a tribute to all the port workers at the Albert Basin, and the council will manage that funding, hopefully, if and when it comes. And they're also giving us tremendous support in our SS Alder project this year, when we'll site a memorial in August at Victoria Locks for the crew who were lost on the Alder, which sunk off Greencastle in April 1937. So the council do the best they can with the limited resources available, but also help in kind is tremendous. And as you say, the encouragement, the pointers in the right direction, the guidance.
And I think particularly, again, going back to the John Martin Garden Memorial, the groundwork was done by the council, and very generously done by the council. So it was a joint effort between public and private finance, the John Martin Memorial.
Well, again, to get back to Buttercrane, Anthony, in February, as you know, you did the presentation. That was a great collaborative effort between public, private and voluntary sectors, because the council facilitated us with the chairs, brought the chairs down and more importantly, took them away again. And we had, of course, the input from Buttercrane Shopping Centre providing the venue and our own contribution after that.
Well, within a very short period of time, a commercial thoroughfare in the centre of the Buttercrane was turned into the Anne Summers Temporary Lecture Theatre.
Why could you not have said the Spar Lecture Theatre, Anthony?
Because at one stage I thought there was going to be a free gift for everyone in the audience, but there wasn't, James.
Last week we had the chairman of Dromlane Community Association here, and we, as a result of his contribution, we thought that Father Tumblety would be oversubscribed, dispensing absolutions, etc. We may have to slot you in for an appointment with Pat as well.
Again, you're talking about newry people. There's Pat Tumblety. You think of John O'Rourke, Father Collins, all tremendous newry men who came back to the town.
And Anthony, just before we finish, tell us about the side altar in St Catherine's, and the connection to the Pierce family.
Oh, well, our conversations sort of come full circle now, James, because we're back to 1916, and Padraig Pierce's father put in the side altar, and Willie Pierce probably worked with him. I don't think Padraig worked much with the father, but we gather that Willie worked a lot with the father. And if you go up to Glasnevin, I think there's a monument that Willie was actually involved in. Of course, Willie was shot too in 1916. So there's not that nice link to where we started our conversation.
And Anthony, it brings us to the end, and hopefully everything will go okay now with the Jenny Werner statue. And it would be lovely to see her there in Hill Street alongside her husband, because sadly Jenny is buried in New York, isn't that right?
She is. They lost a son at Gettysburg. They lost a son as commander Fort Sumter. She travelled oceans to be with him throughout her life, but when he died she was in America, and now she's buried in America. So as I go back to the idea of the birthday present, although she's over there and he's over here, on the streets where they walk together, we would like to bring them together, if only in statue form.
A modern day Romeo and Juliet.
Indeed, and the thing, of course, as you can see there, James, I don't know if your camera can pick it up, but they were strikingly beautiful people. Jenny was a real stunner, and of course Mitchell is Byron in many ways, with the lock of hair that he would curl when he was thinking. So, not only have they a tremendous story, but they look good, which of course must be good for a film at some stage.
And would you see yourself as the lead role, Anthony?
You're a very cruel man, James. Because I did mention a lock of hair. You just get in there with that, didn't you?
Well, the Armagh remark had to be repaid, Anthony. Anthony Russell, thank you very much.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.